Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Inside the Psychopathic Mind podcast. Again, your hosts, myself, Jason Smith, with Carl Giacono.
Hey,
And
Jason.
hey, Carl, how's it going today?
Hanging in there today. How about you?
Not too bad. For this episode, we're going to do a couple of different things. We're going to address some comments that we've had over some of the past couple of videos and that we've shared. And again, thanks everybody for writing in. Appreciate it, your interest. We want to reward that. We want to kind of go into what you have talked about. We're going to address some of the comments that we've seen, and then the second half of the episode, we're going to talk about something called the criminal personality. That was first introduced by Yochelson and Samenow in the mid to late 70s. So we're going to talk about that, what that has to do in combination with psychopathy. But before we begin, we're just going to go into before we begin with the criminal personality, we're going to get into some of the comments that people have addressed. So we'll kind of go through them. We'll kind of touch base on them and go from there. So the first one,
Yeah.
um,
Jason, these were real
go ahead.
interesting. I mean, it's
Yeah.
one of the drawbacks of not having a live podcast. It'd be nice to talk to people and interact a little bit.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'll field the first one because this was a comment. Very interesting content. Looking forward to the next episode. Congratulations on your podcast. How about one on Wade Wilson? Of course, as being someone who collected comic books over the year, I thought this was a joke at first because, of course, most people would know that this is Deadpool. But when I actually researched it and looked it up, the guy was called the Deadpool Killer. And
Hmm.
so a comment like this, what I'd say to the person that made it, I think you're on the right track. And it's probably a good idea if you think about some of our podcasts and the criteria for psychopathy, begin to compare them to someone like this that you may have an interest in or you suspect something. And who knows, at some point, maybe we'll be able to actually look at the case because it did look like an interesting case.
Maybe we'll compare him to Deadpool, the comic book character, and real life. You never know. We could go back and forth between those two.
It would be fun. It'd be fun to do an episode of looking at villains in the comic book world and seeing which ones might have been psychopaths.
Yeah, yeah, I think that would be a good one. All right, and then I guess we could kind of also somebody else asked about Gypsy Rose Blanchard as well. So again, a couple of people interested to trying to present different cases and trying to use our material that we've kind of presented to try to kind of be on to see if these people that are in the news that are kind of these high profiles are considered psychopaths. And you have anything to add about Gypsy Rose?
Same kind of thing as with Wade Wilson with Deadpool,
Hmm.
we'll call him. Yes, I think whoever had that insight, that may be something worth exploring because it's a very interesting case and there's some striking things in that case that are worth making note of.
Yeah, and I think yeah, that could be also something that we could do in a future episode. There was one commenter that talked about having an adoptive daughter that they believe is a psychopath. I think we are trying to line up a couple of people in the future about survivor groups and people that have in the family that they've experienced some psychopathic traits or behaviors towards themselves. So hopefully we'll be able to address that. Carl, I
Yeah,
know you've kind of talked about some of that stuff as well.
yeah, I think Jason, something to add to that. One of the things with the criminal personality, when we talk about this and Yochelson and Samonow's work, they were very empathetic and often found a lot of things that the families of these individuals had to go through. And often the families were signaled out and blamed for the behavior of what was going on. And one of the things in the treatment process of offenders, not necessarily psychopaths, but some of these people that they studied, when there was change beginning to happen, they would often begin to adopt different thinking around their families. Well, maybe it wasn't my family all the time. Maybe a lot of it had to do with who I was and what I put them through. So, I mean, it's a
Yeah.
certainly for, I think we can speak for both of us, Jason, that our heart goes out to people having to struggle with that because you often find very few allies or mental health people that are aware of the issues and are supporting. But on the bright side, there are survivor groups and support groups and different resources out there that, as Jason said, we're hoping to get somebody on that can talk about that specifically.
And just to kind of piggyback that comment too, obviously, you know, when we've interviewed these people, they've been either in a hospital or a prison setting, and they cause us problems. I can only imagine what they caused at home prior to coming to these facilities, right? So, yeah, definitely empathize with the family that had to live that, and hopefully, and sometimes again, the manipulation and things like that continue even while they're in prison. So, that's the unfortunate thing. Another good comment was talking about a little different things about how there may be some different levels of severity. I guess we can talk about that, but also that many psychopaths, soldiers, police officers, CEOs, not all are criminals. So I don't know about this. Well, I guess the severity, obviously, it's a continuum, right? It's 0 to 40. That we use 30 as like the cutoff, but yes, obviously, the higher the worse it is.
Well, it's kind of a complex question in a way, Jason, because
Yeah.
it says not all criminals. No, they're all doing criminal behavior, some of them not arrested.
Yes.
Remember that famous case, and we caution people because we're not labeling people that are living psychopaths that we haven't evaluated. It's more like that their histories may be consistent with psychopathy or with the PCLR. And there was that case of Jeffrey McDonald. He was in the military, the one where his family, he was convicted of murdering his family and creating a crime scene, much like the Manson family. It was back in those days. And he was a doctor. In many ways, he would have been highly successful. But if you look at the history like somebody, you still find that they're getting into fights, they're doing illegal activities, they may not be getting caught for them. And I think Paul Babiak's work in a book called, is it Snakes in Suits, Jason?
And suits. Yep.
He found that during times of chaos that you will find people very high on psychopathy that kind of rise to the top. And he talks about that issue. So if you are struggling with those kind of things or curious about them, that would be a book we would highly recommend.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you hit it right there on the head. They're engaging in criminal behavior, but not always arrested, right? Sometimes they're, you know, acting in those gray areas. All right. And then another good question was, are high IQ psychopaths at a higher or lower risk of violence, sex offending, or other reoffending than those with average IQs? And then also asking if a confounding issue is that those evaluated are the ones who get caught, more likely to have characteristics including impulsivity, poor behavioral controls, and criminal versatility.
Yeah, another complex but good question. The complexity comes with the answer. It doesn't have a simple answer. I mean, I can remember working in an institution, and here was one psychopath that didn't have a very high IQ. We were about to kick him out of the drug program because he got another dirty UA. In other words, his urine stream was dirty. So he comes into me and he says, "Hey, doc, I didn't smoke that pot. These guys, they held me down in the bathroom and blew the pot smoke into my mouth." Of course, I started laughing. And when I started laughing, he started laughing. I told him I'd never heard one like that before, but that was the greatest amount of bullshit I've heard in a week. And then we began to laugh about it because he was full of crap. But that would be an example of a rather unsophisticated way of trying to get out of something that he did.
Yep.
But no matter what the IQ, I imagine some of it might modify the types of crimes they choose.
Yep.
Even though even at a high IQ, they're still doing the other sorts of offenses and behaviors.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about it how we've had high IQ people in our sample and low IQ people in their sample. It just again, I guess it would depend on choosing what crimes that they do or how high are they on the impulsivity and the proneness to boredom and things like that. And again, variance within the assessment.
Yeah, it's Queckley's idea of the good intelligence. In other words, the behavior isn't due to a psychosis or something like that. They have good intelligence. It really has to do a lot of what we're going to talk about today with the criminal personality, a style of thinking and behavior that leads to these things.
Yep. I think, yeah, it has to, yeah, their thinking that leads to that behavior is perfect way to kind of to frame it. Um, Another one was about, when we talked about like 1% of the population is psychopathic, approximately 350 million people in the US. So that's probably about 3 million. I think the last estimates I saw, there's only probably about a million people in prison and jails currently in the US. So, and again, not all people in prison are psychopathic. So maybe a quarter of those people are. So you probably have a good, I don't know, 2 million people out there, at least in the United States. There's a
You
lot
can
more
find
people
them,
in the world.
yeah, you can find them in most walks of life, but they're often
Yeah.
attracted because of this criminal type personality to positions of power, control, where they get admiration and attention,
Yep.
and so forth. It's the nature of their personality.
Yeah. So again, we appreciate everyone for commenting uh, positively, and we've had some not great comments, but we'll leave it at that. We appreciate the engagement, I guess, and people watching the videos and taking the time to write in about it. So thank you for that. And now we're going to move on to criminal personality, unless Carl, you had any more thoughts about any comments like that.
No, I was thinking about some of the other comments that we didn't mention.
Yeah, well, you know, you can find them if you wanted to. So, yeah, so we'll move on next to the criminal personality.
Yeah, Jason, I think we're going to try to keep this short and succinct so we don't overload people with a lot of academic material about it.
Hmm.
But what I want to say, the criminal personality is the criminal personality idea is to treatment and attempting to help folks, not necessarily with psychopathy, but with antisocial disorders, criminal behaviors. It's akin to treatment, as is the PCLR in assessing psychopathy is to kind of predicting future behavior and assessment.
Yes.
And the criminal personality, it was one of my first loves because when I began working in institutions, I noticed that typical types of treatment were not, the people were not responding to it. I remember in a practicum, I was working in a jail and I tape recorded the session for my supervision. And my practicum teacher, when she listened to it, because I'm there listening to the inmate, I'm reflecting back very nicely, doing all my Rogerian stuff and so forth. And she said, Carl, you're really doing a good job in there, but is this what the person needs? So, I mean, that was one of the first thoughts that it isn't my job as a mental health worker to bring my preconceived notions and bullshit into the situation and expect people to behave based on my theories. No, it really behooved me. And actually, Carl Rogers talked about this to enter the client's world and understand from their perspective what was going on. And the beauty of this is exactly what Yochelson and Samenow did. Whereas a lot of the things that come out of the academic settings and research has what Bob Hare calls an armchair quality. It's people that read articles, maybe you never had any exposure to the population, and they're writing lofty opinions about what's really happening. This happens often in university settings in different ways. Whereas what Yochelson and Samenow did, they worked primarily in those days at St. Elizabeth's Hospital on the East Coast, and they interviewed the inmates. They had the inmates begin to write lengthy journals about what they were thinking, what was going on, and so forth, thinking that led to behavior. And what they called as one of the things is opening the channel wide, getting the inmates that were in the change process, as they called it, to kind of record the things that were actually going on in their mind. And the importance of this methodology and the importance of the criminal personality is actually, whereas so many of the things we've talked about, Jason, it can be hard for people to take something away and say, well, that's going to help me identify, understand, and so forth. But this has something to offer in that regard. And I recommend two books to our listeners about this. One is called Inside the Criminal Mind by Stanton Samenow. And Inside the Criminal Mind is an abbreviated shorthand version of these lengthy volumes that Yochelson and Samenow did. And you can go to this book and read it and say, okay, that's why this person's doing that. This is how they think about it. The other book that I offer, and it's in general for toxic kinds of people you may interact with, but it has some relevance here too, is called Walking on Eggshells. I believe it's called Taking My Life Back when someone you love has borderline personality disorder. And these are very practical books that when I worked even outpatient and worked with families that had offenders or personality disordered individuals, I'd have the families read the book and then we'd talk about that as a starting point for helping to intervene. So, yeah, so
So
these, yeah,
yeah, to kind of piggyback off of that. So, um, and I think that is probably very powerful, right? When you get these people that are dealing with the families of the offender to then like start realizing, all right, this is how they're thinking, this is what they did. How did that kind of help the therapy or things like that?
yeah, because Jason, you see it because a lot of the families you'll have enabling on one or more of the parents when you have an adolescent that has these issues. For instance, here was one father, and the common thinking problem with the father is basically a responsible guy and very successful, is that, well, I used to do that when I was a kid. And what I would say to the father after reading the book, okay, you did that behavior, but did you lack a conscience? Were you concerned about behaviors hurting other people? And I would begin to point out the differences between him and his son, who was smoking pot chronically, getting into trouble and having assaults and so forth. So see, this idea of the criminal thinking and the criminal personality provides a model for intervening and dealing with family systems as well as individuals. So, what I might talk about, what did Yochelson and Samenow find in their work in doing these things? Well, they found what they would eventually call a criminal lifestyle, a way that these people interacted that was quite different than people who were responsible. In fact, one of the things that they did is they thought about behavior on a continuum that on one end was responsible and the other end was the extreme criminal. And in between, at some point, was arrestable offenses, non-arrestable offenses, but they kind of divided behavior in looking at it from that perspective. They threw out a lot of the psychodynamic things and the typical treatment approaches because they do help us understand the offender, but they were not useful in the treatment. And so they developed a model of what was called accountability. And what I would do when I worked at times was working with juveniles at a probation camp at this time, I'd often say to the kids the typical things. I'd say to the guys, I'd say, well, look, guys, why'd you get in trouble? Oh, my parents did this, and no one gave me this, and no one did that, and the typical things. And then I'd say to them, well, that's all sounds plausible and interest, but did your parents teach you to lie? Did your parents teach you to do drugs? Did your parents teach you to steal? And isn't it true that there was at least that minister that reached out to you, or maybe there was an uncle that took you under the wing, but you rejected these people. You stole the stamp collection from the uncle, and anybody that tried to reach out to you in positive ways, you were not interested in following. In fact, when your parents took you to new schools, isn't it true that when you'd walk down the hallway to the new principal's office, you already picked out all the people that were doing the kind of things that you like to do? You picked out the ones smoking pot chronically. You picked out the ones that were skipping class, and you knew them before anyone else. And obviously, when this is said with a sense of humor, of course, the kids crack up because they know what's really going on. And this raises 2 points. One is criminals perceive kindness and weakness, and if you're gullible, they see you as vulnerable and worthy of taking advantage of. So right away, this style of interacting tells these kids that I kind of understand it. The second thing we would do early, probably the first group session with these kids, is I'd say to them, now, after they told me the things they thought caused the behavior, which is the things they often learn from mental health counselors, that, it's really the family, it's really this and that. I've got nothing to do with it. I'm not accountable. What Yochelson and Samenow called a crybaby session, where they would do the victim stance, which is one of the criminal things. Woe is me, everyone else is to blame. I'd say to them, and in this way, they were actually very insightful. Remember, I did dozens of these groups, so this stuff's repeated over and over. Okay, now I hear what you said. We talked a little bit about that. Seems like maybe there may be something else going on here that we missed. I want you to tell me this. Tell me how you're different than all the kids that go to school. They go to school on time, they study, they get A's and B's. and they don't, and they seem to get along. These kids that you would consider square or straight is what they used to think in those days. I don't know what the terms are anymore. And they say, well, we get bored easily. We don't follow the rules. We like to do things that are exciting. We don't like the mundane. If there's something we can do to stimulate a little action, we're there. We don't like going to school. It's boring. And we like using drugs and we like doing this and this. So basically, these kids were listing Yochelson and Samenow's criminal thinking errors. So, I mean, see, the insight, it's like when we talked about collectively and specific loss of insight and so forth, they don't have insight necessarily how things apply to them to take responsibility for it, but they can list those things in their personality that are causing the problem. What the therapist has to do is make the links to how these things are causing your problems and why you might want to change. And before I get into that point, these are mainly talking about the boys I worked with. And then it would have been similar with adults, that I'll give more examples later. But how about with the women with the idea of the criminal thinking or having this style of thinking that's different?
Yeah, victim, taking on the victim stance is a big thing that they do. A lot of the crimes are maybe, um, blamed on a boyfriend, husband, things like that. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have been engaged in some of those things. But then you go into it specifically, and sometimes they're the ones that had the idea in the first place. They also inflexibility a lot with change and things like that. So very kind of hammering down on not seeing the need for change, or just continuing on their same way, expecting a different result by the same kind of behaviors. Cut off, I think we'll talk about that, but they use cut off and committing their crime. They're down at the bottom, nothing else to do, so might as well just engage in that type of behavior.
Well, you
Uh,
alluded something too with your comments, Jason, the
mhm.
peculiarities of their thinking problems, which is this isn't one of the thinking issues, but this is what they do. They have fragmented thinking. In other words, when it's important for them to focus to justify behavior, they go to a specific. When it's advantageous, they go to the global. And I'll give you examples of this. And this is the inconsistency in their thinking that Yochelson and Samenow discovered. A global way of thinking about it is, here's an inmate that comes in and I'm talking to him and say, well, how's it going in the treatment program? Oh, it's wonderful, doc. Everything's going well. Well, I said, well, how are the therapists? Oh, they're great. Everything's good. And then I finally say to him, I want you to tell me one thing in the last week that you've done differently based on what you've learned in treatment. Now, all of a sudden, the unchanged criminal, they don't have a clue. See, they focus on the global to justify the idea of what Yochelson and Samenow said, I'm a good person, I'm superior to other people, and so forth. In all their behaviors is what this is called power thrusting, where they're moving to keep their image of being better than anybody and superior. Now, the focus on the detail and then moving to the global goes like this. Guy comes in, well, you got in trouble for stealing this stuff. What was that about? Well, see, I needed money to buy food for my family. Notice that's a specific detail. So where I'm going to take this is along the lines of this. Well, wasn't it true at some point you were working at a job and making money? Yeah. Well, what did you do with the money you were working at the job? Well, I spent it on drugs. Oh, so you didn't spend it on your family at there. Now, isn't it true you got fired from the job? What happened there? Well, there was a mutual disagreement. I said, oh, wait a minute. Isn't it true because you were using drugs, you started going in late all the time? And eventually the guy got tired of you. Not only that, from our previous discussion, you felt that this job was beneath you, which is another criminal thinking area. That's superior. They want to be the head of the corporation. They don't want to start out mopping floors. And that attitude of superiority just offended people and rubbed them the wrong way. Oh, yeah, I guess so. See, so in their thinking, they're going to focus on a detail if that supports the idea of their image as a good person. And if it isn't, they'll go global if that supports it. See, one of the things Yochelson and Samenow in their thinking pattern was this constant need to be able to see themselves as a good person. And they labeled one of these thinking areas sentimentality. What this had to do with, they could have a few good acts, like they go to church on Sunday, they beat their wife in between and are irresponsible in between, but they're a good person because of the one act. It's
It's
another
really,
part of fragmented thinking,
yeah.
but it's also underneath is this power thrust and always building themselves up and the image they have of being a good person. In Yochelson and Samonow's terms, this was called criminal pride. So I'm
Mhm.
integrating some of the thinking ideas with this style of how they think differently.
Well, and then the females would be the same way, right? The sentimentality that that they're a good mother. Maybe, oh yeah, I brought no, there was one kid, one time I brought my daughter out to this big birthday party, amusement park and things like that. And then yeah, and then, all the other days she's out, doing drugs or doing crime and dropping the daughter off with the grandmother and not seeing her for weeks at a time. So yeah, so that sentimentality, so really, obviously I'm a good person, but when it comes to the females, like that, I'm a good mother is a very big one. And when you challenge that, that causes a lot of difficulties, yeah, in treatment.
It's a threat to their self worth and how they regulate it.
Yes.
And really, what Yochelson and Samenow talked with this is they called it a lot of what the criminal does is to avoid the zero state.
Hmm.
See, you and I and the regular folks that are listening, we all have days where we're a little down, things aren't going right. But usually, even when we have those days, we think, okay, well, this is kind of what's going on. We can probably make it till tomorrow. Things will look up. When the criminal has this zero state kind of experience, it's like the world is awful. Everyone can see how bad it is. I'm worthless, and it's never going to change. So their experience in regulating their self-worth, you're either in the criminal pride, you're better than everyone, you're a good person. To let anything into that way of thinking results in this inner state of emptiness and worthlessness. So you're going to see that you do everything possible to avoid that. And one of the things in treatment, you're going to learn to get into that and tolerate it. So it's not an impetus for acting out, but it's part of the personality. In our dynamic thinking with males, that's really the narcissism, the grandiosity and the inner worthlessness. But Yochelson and Samenow talked about it in a manner in which you can intervene and work with and do things with.
That's a good point that you made. Yeah, that zero state. I think that kind of relates to the females just cut off. Like that's when they just like, fuck it. I'm just gonna do whatever I want and just go from there. Do all the drugs or commit the crime. There's no point, you know, adding to some of that stuff as well. So
See,
uh
that's what they'll tell themselves, just like you said,
yeah,
there's no point. They'll
yeah,
make that decision.
yep.
Yochelson and Samenow talked about two mechanisms in the thinking process. One was corrosion, where they gradually talk themselves into something, like you're saying
Hmm.
there. The other is cutoff, where it's just automatically they just kind of give up and resign themselves to the behavior that's occurring.
Yes, yeah. And then obviously, yeah, in treatment, changing all those, not only those thinking errors and things like that, getting them to trying to find different ways to act out their behaviors. So
But specifically in the treatment, then what you do around this is you're going to be doing a lot of journaling, and the inmates come into the group and you talk about what's thinking, and you offer alternate ways of thinking. For example, here's an inmate that he was actually a psychopath, so I really didn't have success for him. I'll tell you about how he then would reoffend, but when he would go out in the community, he wouldn't cross a red light, just cross the street, even if it's 3 in the morning. Because with the criminal, instead of what they do is once they cross that red light, it's like, oh, this won't hurt. It's like the alcoholic with one drink won't hurt. They have no capacity early in the treatment process of stopping the thinking once it gets in the direction of the criminal behavior. Rather than what he learned to tell himself was that if I do this, when does it stop? I need to follow every rule because I'm not confident in my ability at this point to then know where my limits are. In other words, how much is too much? Will one drink really hurt? Now, eventually, this guy he had a job that he quit because the job was beneath him. It was starting at the bottom, and of course, he didn't tell me about it coming into treatment. I wonder why he didn't bother to tell me about that. Then he finally comes in, and well, what I said about that, I said to him, we broke it down. I said, let's look at why you. And he finally would get fired from the job. why did you get fired from the job? And he started out, well, we left out of a mutual understanding. So I'm thinking to myself, yeah, right. What's that like? And then I say to him, well, tell me how many times a week you were going in late. Oh, I start going in 15 minutes late. It's about every day. And then, okay. And when you did go because you thought you were better and this job was beneath you, how did you rub people at the job the wrong way because of that attitude? Well, yeah, I argued with the boss. I did that. Okay. Remember, it started out, once again, it was a mutual disagreement. There's the detail. Now I'm breaking it down and looking at, in fact, that's the global. Now I'm breaking it down and looking at the details. And then I said to him after we got done with that, and you're coming into your therapy sessions 10 minutes late every week, and I'm about to report you to your probation officer, and you're going to get violated from that. So, see, the idea with criminals as a therapist, we're not judging them, but we're looking at what that old practicum supervisor told me. Carl, what is it he needs? So when you get someone to buy into a program and say, you know what, I am tired of this. You break it down for them. Aren't there times when you assaulted someone or did something stupid that you actually did feel bad about? Now, these are the non-psychopaths. And they'll say, well, yeah, well, what I'm going to teach you is a method of learning to control your behavior. And you got two choices. You either go this way and you're going back to the prison, or you're going this way to a different kind of life. And let me tell you, it's going to be much easier going back to prison than doing the work it will take to stay straight and in the community. So you kind of will have the criminals write down and keep journals, which you'll come in and talk about. With the juveniles, the same thing. They bring in their journals. You maybe break it down to about 5 of these errors that Yochelson and Samenow found to focus on, and you're teaching them different ways of communicating and dealing with in the treatment process. You're recreating their thinking. For example, another thing you'll do with anger, which is one of the things Yochelson and Samenow talked about, is you'll teach them to be responders, not reactors. We used to put this model up, ABCD, of it goes from events, feelings, events, thinking, feelings, and behavior. With criminals, right away, they're getting into trouble. I mean, someone steps on their foot and they're in a fight. And I used to talk about this. We give this example to the guys to show them how it worked. These are adults. I'd say to them, okay, you're out on parole a couple of weeks. You got your new suit there. You see this lady in the bar that you'd like to connect with, and somebody spills a drink on you. What happens? And the guys would say, well, there might be an oh, bullshit. There might not be an altercation. You got into a fight, right? Okay. Well, now tell me what happens here. You turn around about to hit the person and you see they got a seeing eye dog and a cane and dark glasses. Then what they say is, well, he didn't mean it. Now, notice the difference in those responses. In that second thing, they're interjecting a thought. In the first thing, they're just reacting. And then that would help to get them to buy into the idea of maybe wanting to change, or that there might be hope of change, because you can change and slow down your reaction times. And I would tell them, next time you get into a fight, I don't want you to do it because you're impulsive and not thinking. I want you to have thought this through and slow down the behavior and consider the consequences. So the criminal thinking model, what it offers us with these ideas is ways to confront and deal with the specific thinking so they can slow down reaction times and make different decisions. It's Jason, all the things I'm saying: think, decide, choice, slow down. Because see, the criminals in their thinking, they have what Yochelson and Samenow would call fragmentation. These extremes, I'm a good person, but I do, in these lack of connections. Their thinking tends to be concrete. And what that means, concrete thinking, I'm reminded of the case of Willie Sutton, who was a famous bank robber. And apparently he's in the court, and the judge says to him, well, Mr. Sutton, why is it you rob banks? And Willie gives it a thought, and he says, well, Your Honor, that's where they keep the money. See, that isn't what the judge was asking, but that's a concrete thinking. Another example is a guy that I believe he murders someone down in the San Diego area, and then he starts to drive to Canada to get away from the police. And when he's arrested and interviewed, says, how far is Mexico from San Diego? What, 15, 20 minutes? And they said, the question to him, why didn't I don't get it. Why are you driving Canada? Why didn't you go to Mexico? And he says, well, doc, you don't understand. I can't speak Spanish. So this is often the kind of thing that traps criminals and gets them to mess up these thinking issues and lack of connections. And the treatment really, Jason, it goes in the direction of what I used to call the four cornerstones of forensic treatment, which are reality therapy, William Glasser's work. And these are all good books for people who want to understand that. As Glasser talks about really the structure of the treatment setting and accountability. Then there's various people. You may throw in a few that deal with cognitive behavioral therapy, rational behavior training. This has a lot to do with controlling anger and slowing down reactions and so forth. And then the criminal thinking. And finally, the relapse prevention, which is relapse prevention is a cognitive behavioral techniques that really deal with when you get out and things you're going to do to prevent behavior from occurring in advance. In other words, you would give the criminal the example is you got out, you did this thing here. Where was the problem? Where did it begin? And you can often trace it back to thinking, and you may have an example of this, thinking and behaviors that occurred 4 steps before the actual behavior that they were arrested for. Think about a child molester. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
report they got depressed. They're driving around the school. Then, they're spending time doing it. Then they finally pick up the child. Well, where did that begin? Picking up the child? No, they could have done something back when they saw the warning signs of their depression way back on the chain.
Oh yeah, I've seen it too. When maybe somebody passes away, that dies, and then they realize they don't understand the cycle that they go in, and then then they're using again. So versus getting help with their grief and things like that. So yeah, the relapse prevention. Obviously, they always think, especially like when it comes to anger or any type of behavior, they always feel like it always just happens, automatically. But that is not the case. Like you
No.
can walk it back. There was a whole bunch of little things that led up to either the relapse or the reoffending or an infraction in prison or things like that.
So yes, whether it's the criminal thinking per se or it's the actual behavior, these things form patterns. It's the idea if you're having the criminals kind of jot this down and working in groups on what could have you thought differently there? What could have you done differently? What will you do differently in the future? You're helping them kind of gain control over their behavior. And not so much with psychopaths, but for most people that are antisocial and get in trouble with the law, they don't like to be out of control or have people controlling them. So when you begin to present a model that helps them access and gain control, there's some appeal to that. And it only can occur really, I don't know what your thoughts and what you've seen, Jason, is if you have a mental health worker that doesn't come from this kind of model or perspective, they're seen as naive, gullible, and weak, and they tend to be devalued and manipulated. And the inmate has no respect, even in the inmate's code, kind of people like that. Whereas if you kind of confront them and can talk about these things, it's a way that you eventually give respect. And for our audience there, I want to talk about confrontation. It's not hitting people over the head, yelling, screaming, getting in their face. It's just pointing out inconsistencies. It can be very powerful. You say this, but you did that. You say this is why you lost the job, but isn't it true this and that? This is confrontation because you're pointing out these differences in their fragmented thinking. And what you're doing then is creating bridges to different kinds of thinking, which thinking leads to behavior.
Yeah, I totally agree. If people come in with a different model, that's why I think, obviously a lot of the prisons use the CBT, a form of the criminal thinking. Uh, Glenn Walters did a lot on the criminal lifestyle, and that's used a lot in the federal systems. But I'm, go to the majority of the state prisons, and this is the type of treatment to kind of deal with that
Well,
population.
I can speak about that to my days working for the feds. Jason, is in those days you got no time off for completing the substance abuse program. So prior to them initiating that policy, we had to go out and drum up business. That means
Mhm.
inmates that came to see us, they were pretty serious about changing, and we had to gain their respect. As soon as they implement the policy, and you probably you're still working there, you may not want to comment on it, but as soon as they implement this policy of now you're going to get a year off if you complete the substance abuse program, we had waiting lists, and guess who showed up for treatment that never showed up under the other model? Every psychopath in the institution. And there were
Yep.
strategies for keeping them out of the program and dealing with them ethically and so forth. But
Hmm.
that first approach where they have nothing to gain except change itself,
Yes.
boy, that allows a mental health worker to really bring in people that are going, you swim or sink based on what you have to offer and who you are as a treater.
Yes. Yeah. If they are there just for the change, then yeah, you'll get some people that do the program because they don't get the time off. That's few and far between. And finding out the real reason for that. But yeah, I'll keep my comments about that maybe for a different podcast down the line.
And the
But
other thing with that, when they
yeah,
start coming in and you get all kinds of psychopaths, and then I'll give you an
yeah,
example of a psychopathic group we used to run at the one place I was. You get all those people coming in, it tends to shut down the people who are vulnerable and actually want to change.
yes,
I mean, what we would do in the groups, what I would do the first group, because I'd go in with the people I was trained to run the groups. I say, look, now, here's what's going to happen within 3 groups. About 3 groups, you're going to start to get on my therapist's case. Let me tell you why you're doing that. It's because some of you really want to change, and you're having to go back in the cell with these people that don't want to change. And you have to have a certain appearance with them. So you got to keep up that image. So instead of dealing with that issue that you have conflicts with the people back in the cell, what you're going to do is you're going to start taking out my therapist. Well, I don't want that to happen. And guess what? Then it would never happen. But see, if you didn't do that, almost every time this would occur. But Yochelson and Samonow's model, kind of with the criminal personality, kind of a somewhat of a summary statement from me, is they cause this closed channel where you never know what the criminal is actually thinking. And I was working in an institution years ago, and I had 7 psychopaths in the group, and it was my co-facilitator was Mike English. He was a social worker. So one day in the group, the power shut down. So I say to Mike, okay, we can't do much. There's dim light here. That this is a criminal thinking group. Why don't we check out what these guys are thinking? So I said, let's go around. I'd like you to share honestly what's going through your head. Bill, what about you? Well, Doc, you know, I saw the power go off. I wondered if I could get how long it would take me to get out that door and over the roof of the institution and escape. I'm saying, okay, Bill, thanks for sharing. That's productive. Okay, next. Steve, what are you thinking about? Well, Doc, when I was in your office, I always wondered if you got stuff that was in your drawer that I could make into a weapon or turn into a lockpick. Okay, thanks for sharing, Steve. And it went on and on like that.
yeah,
But with gullible people, when they're working with these folks, you never really know what's going through your mind. And you should
hmm
just really assume kind of it's probably not what you think it is.
yeah. I think it goes back to the kind of that naive. You're dealing in prison, but you really don't know if you think that there's all good in the world and all these things. You may be that kindness for weakness, and I think we've talked about that a lot in the stuff that we wrote, like these you know people from academia go in and do studies on psychopathy in prison and see them for about 45 minutes, take their word for whatever they're telling you, and half of it is not true. And they're just, today's the day I'm going to, tell this crazy story that's not true to this person that I'll never see again. Yeah, it
For
kind of goes from there.
entertainment,
Yeah, just for
because they're
entertainment.
bored. And think about what the inmates taught us. They taught us in their own language if you just listen. What they always
Yes.
said to me is, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So I
Yeah.
mean, if you go in there gullible, that's their code. That's how they see the world. And this is the criminal personality, a different lifestyle, different view of the world. And with non-psychopathic criminals, you can have really dramatic effects and help them over a long period of time if you're approaching it right. I remember
Yes.
my juvenile clients when they would get out, because I'd see them at the probation camp and then you get out for follow-up treatment. And they'd say to the therapist, I want that stuff that Dr. Jacone or Dr. Carl does, not this wimpy stuff. So in their mind, accountability and being confronted, which they
Yeah.
saw as caring, because you cared enough to know who they were, that was what they wanted to do if they wanted to change. And they know they needed that.
Yeah. And I think, might be another episode in itself, treatment with psychopathy. And I think you've mentioned it, we don't know if they're treatable or not, but this at least is one way to try to approach it, right?
Yes, it's at least a sound, professional, ethical, and common sense way of attempting to approach it. And you just never know. You
Yeah.
never know if something will catch on. I mean, with some psychopaths, depending on their score, I've been able to help them have better behavior within the institution.
Yep.
Who knows what happens when they get out of the institution? I
Yes.
mean, I had one guy I worked with that kept coming back to haunt me. And he was the guy that we slowed down his behavior. He was the guy who I put him in room seclusion would say to me, well, Doc, you like this. And he tried to engage me in those sadistic kind of projective identification cycles. Well, then I went to do a presentation at another hospital in the state, and people weren't showing up for the presentation or late. I said, what the hell's going on here? And they said, well, you know, that guy that transferred up here, we think he has a weapon and we're shaking down his room. So I go to talk to him. I says, you know, so and so, how are you doing? He says, well, you know, doctor, a little lenient here. And he's laughing and stuff. And then years later, I'm doing an outpatient presentation for outpatient therapists in California at a conditional release program. And I present the case like this with no names and anything. And the director of the program says, he says, Carl, you know, we got that guy. He says, that guy won the lottery for like $200,000. In the middle of my presentation, I just sat down and it's like my whole world crashed. This is the reward for being a psychopath. You end up,
Yeah.
this guy would never leave me. He kept coming back. And, but that's
Yeah.
tales of psychopathy. That's for another episode.
Yes. Yes. So, kind of closing summary, kind of thoughts about criminal personnel. Obviously, we've mentioned a couple books.
Yes.
This is probably those books probably I think can help people, especially if they're dealing who they think, people that are just committing crime. It doesn't necessarily have to be quote unquote psychopath, but somebody that's engaged in criminal behavior that you kind of want to see what is kind of going on with them or how they could possibly help or understand them a little bit better and maybe kind of protect themselves so that they don't continue to fall for the same thing that the person may be continuing to do.
I think that's the biggest takeaway, Jason, besides some of the information we put out and our bantering back and forth, is those books are actually useful because those books are what I used to use when I worked with families. And when I work with adults, I'd have adult offenders come in and, maybe their family was not. I said, here, I want you to get this book and read it. And I'd say to them, does any of that apply to you? They said, nah,
Mm-hmm.
nah, nah. I said, okay, I can't help you. Here, I'll
Yeah.
refer you to somebody else. The same way with families. If there was one
Yeah.
or more parents enabling, you read the book. Does any of that apply to your son or daughter? No, no, no. Okay, well, I really can't help you then. Here. And
Yeah.
so, but most of them, after I told them I couldn't help them, they backtracked and began to look at it more openly and honestly. But
Yeah.
some I referred down the
Yeah.
line.
Yeah. That Walking on Eggshells book. Uh, I give it to the inmates and see like this is what you did to your family, or I think there's another one like I love you, don't leave me, or I hate
Yeah.
you, don't something like that, borderline, and they read it and go like, oh, okay, this probably kind of is very very like me. So yes, I think those books are good. So hopefully our listeners found this helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching.
Yep. So again, if anybody can always like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, send some comments in a future episode. We will again address all the comments and questions that people have. So always can find us at Maverick Psychology. You can send us questions there, links to all our books and podcasts and things like that. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. All right. Thank you for watching and listening.